it is important for me to continually emphasize the critical principles of acceptable obedience so that our obedience to God will be the ones that God is looking for, and then it will bring genuineness into our upward look of faith to God in the times of crisis. Number one, obedience to God is a general divine demand from every believer. Obedience to God is a general divine demand from every believer. It is absolutely impossible to be a believer and walk with God without God's demand of obedience. It doesn't matter your color, your tribe, your exposure, your experience. Once you are a believer, God will generally demand obedience from you. No one can escape that divine demand if you are a believer. No one can have a journey walk with God without fulfilling the demands of obedience. Number two, obedience to God must be complete and total. God does not accept partial obedience. God does not accept incomplete obedience. If it is not complete, it is not acceptable to God. It is either 100% obedience or nothing at all. God wants obedience that is complete and obedience that is total. Number three, true obedience must be a willing and enthusiastic one. As a believer, if you are going to obey God acceptably, you must not be compelled to obey God. You must not be coerced to obey God. You must not be forced to obey God. You must obey God willingly and enthusiastically. That is the proof of the genuineness of that obedience. It must be a willing obedience. It must be an enthusiastic obedience. You must be passionate about obeying God, and you must be willing to do so. Number four, God values sacrificial obedience. The obedience that doesn't cost you anything is the obedience that is not acceptable to God. Authentic obedience must cost you something. What obedience to God is costing you is the proof of your commitment, and genuineness is the proof of your love to God, is the proof of your commitment to God. The obedience that doesn't cost you anything does not reflect your love and does not reflect your commitment to God. Number five, acceptable obedience is prompt obedience. We don't obey God when we like. We don't obey God at our own time. We don't obey God when we feel it is convenient for our flesh. If it is going to be acceptable to God, it must be prompt obedience at the timing and instance of God. Number six, true obedience accompanies a life of faithfulness. Nobody can claim to obey God without having a life of faithfulness. It is impossible to be unfaithful and still manifest the virtue of obedience. Obedience and faithfulness are connected. Obedience is always a reflection of faithfulness. It is not possible to be faithful without being obedient. Number seven, God demands regular and consistent obedience. God does not want obedience in one season and then disobedience in another season. One thing that makes obedience acceptable to God is the consistency and the regularity of that obedience. God wants us to obey Him every season, despite changes in times, changes in season, changes in experiences. God wants us to ensure that our obedience to Him is consistent and regular. An inconsistent obedience is an unacceptable obedience. Number eight, obedience is born out of a proper esteem for God's word. If you have respect for the word of God, you won't struggle with obedience to the word of God. If you have respect or value for the word of God, you won't have problems obeying it. So, obedience is a reflection of your esteem or personal value or respect for the word of God. And number nine, Jesus Christ remains the perfect scriptural example to the believer. in obedience. Jesus Christ remains the perfect scriptural example to the believer in obedience. One of the things that Jesus came to establish for us on the earth is how to live in the flesh and obey God. He did that successfully when he died the painful and ignominious death on the cross and rose again the third day. His death on the cross is a complete manifestation of his total obedience to the Father. You hear what he said in the Garden of Gethsemane: Father, if it be possible, let this cup pass over me, but not as I will, thy will be done. So Jesus Christ remains our perfect example of obedience. One of the things we should learn from Jesus is obedience. If we have not learned the lesson of obedience in the life of Christ, we've not learned anything from him. And number 10, acceptable obedience is the product of humility and lowliness of mind. Acceptable obedience is the product of humility and lowliness of mind. Just as obedience reflects faithfulness, in the same manner, obedience reflects humility and lowliness of mind.